Okay, today we're going to be taking a look at how does God reveal God's self to us. So yesterday and the past few days, we've looked at this idea of happiness and joy and how we have a desire to want to be happy. We have a desire to seek happiness and seek joy. Nobody wants to be miserable all the time. So we're going to take a look at kind of the next piece of this unit, which has to do with how is God revealing himself to us. And one of the ways is definitely through these natural desires that we have. And there's some more formal ways as well that we're going to discuss. Many of the things that we're going to talk about are things that you actually brought up already in either your soul project with your small group or in your conversations that you had with adults in your life. Okay, so this is kind of our guiding question for today. And I want to be sure to remind you that it is important for you to pause throughout this video so that you can make sure that you have everything that you need in your notes. I think one of the things that I realized as I was grading your Unit 1 assessment was that some of you did not do an awesome job at taking notes. So make sure you have everything down that you need to have. So just a review of what we had already discussed in your digital learning groups. In that passage that we read from John, when they ask Jesus, like where he's staying, they want to know things about him. Jesus responds by saying, "Come, follow me." So clearly there is a difference here between just knowing stuff about God, knowing kind of facts and details, and actually knowing God. I often think about how there are people that we might follow on social media. Maybe you even followed other girls from SJA on social media before coming here and before actually meeting them. And you knew things about their life. Maybe you knew their dog's name or what they like to do or what they eat or some funny thing that happened to them because you follow them on TikTok. But there's a difference between knowing stuff about someone and actually knowing someone. So that is what Jesus is asking of us. He's saying it's not enough to just know stuff about me. I want you to know me. And how do you do that? You come and follow me. Okay, so that's kind of the backdrop of what we're talking about today. So let's some terminology. Revelation is when God discloses or makes known something about God, the world, or us. So revelation typically occurs when we know something about something, and then God allows us to know more about that thing. So you can even think of like the grand reveal of like a new iPhone or a new platform or something. You might have some details of what that thing is like, but you don't have all of the information. So revelation is when suddenly we have more information about something. Okay, so revelation, when we talk about revelation in theology, we typically distinguish between two types of revelation. One is a more natural type of revelation that we're going to discuss today, things that appear kind of naturally in the world that we can use our senses to come to know more about God through. And the other type of revelation that we're going to talk about later on is called divine revelation. And that is revelation that tells us very specific things about who God is. So these examples are things like the Mass and the Bible and stuff like that. So today we're going to be looking at natural revelation. Natural revelation is when our human facilities, meaning like our senses, our mind, make us capable of coming to a knowledge of the existence of God. Okay, so we can use our senses to determine that there is a God. Okay, we can't know very much more about that God from natural revelation. Okay, we can. This is just the existence of God. This isn't any details about how God loves or how God forgives or anything like that. In other words, The things of the world tell us that God is. Okay, so when we say that God is, we mean just simply that God exists. Okay, so you might know that there is a girl named so and so in our class, but maybe you don't really know much about her beyond the fact that she exists and is in this class. When you know who someone is, you know the details of their life and the inner workings. You actually know them. Okay. So we're going to look at some examples of natural revelation. And again, some are things that we already discussed. Our first example is our desire for happiness and our longing for God. Our desire for happiness and our desire for God means that there must be a God that exists. When you think about your, maybe during B block when you're at school, how your stomach growls and you are so hungry suddenly and you have a desire for food. It's because your body needs food in order to fuel itself. Okay. And food exists. You also might be suddenly really thirsty at certain points of the day because your body needs water. Okay. So this desire for happiness shows us that happiness must exist. Okay. And God speaks to us in our desires. When we have a desire to serve, we have a desire to love, we have a desire for Him. God is very present in these desires, and God places desires on our hearts sometimes too. And so this is definitely an example of one of the natural ways that we can know that God exists because we have these natural desires. Students will often ask, like, well, what if I don't have a desire for God? And that's kind of a tricky question because the church teaches that we all have a desire for God. And so I would argue that someone who says, like, I don't have a desire for God, maybe simply doesn't understand what this means and what we're talking about, because I think we all have a desire for love and for wholeness and for goodness and for all of these things that all of these ways that we can talk about God. So I do think that we all have a desire for God, even if some of us realize it more than others. Okay, example number 2 is reason and intellect. Okay, we have a brain. We talked about the other day. We have a brain, and God gave us a brain, and God wants us to use our brain. Okay, and we can use our brain to discover God. There is nothing wrong with asking questions. There is nothing wrong with trying to dig deeper in certain things, even doubting. I think sometimes we think doubt is the opposite of faith, but in reality, sometimes doubt leads us to a deeper understanding of faith. So example number 2 is reason and intellect, because we can use our reason, our common sense, and our intellect to discover that God is. Again, God gave us a brain, wants us to use it. There are often examples of religious communities who are told not to think about things. And the real gift, I think, of the Catholic tradition is that it is based heavily in thought and philosophy. And there are examples of theologians and people since the beginning of Christianity who have used their reason, their intellect, their brain in order to discover God. Okay, example number 3 is creation and the natural world. Okay, this is kind of an obvious example for natural revelation, natural world. Okay, the world around us is absolutely phenomenal and beautiful. When we observe the world around us, we are often left with a kind of a wow. I know many of you shared your love for the outdoors and for waking up when you're camping and going on hikes in the valley and being outside with your family. There's something special about the natural world, the way that it works, especially the way that animals and trees and all of that stuff work. When you study biology, oftentimes you learn about the complexities of the world that we live in. And this is an example of natural revelation because when we observe the natural world, we can say, wow, somebody must have kind of designed this. This could not all be by chance. Okay. And last example is one that you are going to look a little bit more deeply in with a small group. But just to give you some background of this example, this man named Thomas Aquinas, who was a medieval theologian and philosopher, developed something that we call the 5 proofs for the existence of God. And he, so these proofs are very interesting because they don't necessarily like prove anything. They're more like 5 arguments for the existence of God. And he, in his life, wrote so much, but he was obsessed with the intersection of faith and reason. He really wanted to show through his writings that it was reasonable to be a person of faith and then it makes sense to be a person of faith. So he wrote something that's called the Summa Theologica, which is like a massive set of books. There's, I think, like 12 of them. And what they do is the purpose of them was to convince someone who doesn't already believe in God to believe in God through reason. But it's in my opinion, kind of like a nightmare to read. What he does is he sets up like some sort of a question, like, is it a sin to, I don't know, what do people, is it a sin to watch a scary movie? Something like that. And what he'll do is he will come up with like, he'll list the question and then he'll come up with like an answer, like a very brief answer, like, no, it's not a sin to watch a scary movie because A, B, C, D. And they'll just be like quick statements. And then he'll come up with rebuttals for all of those statements, like someone was arguing with him, like, well, what about this? What about this? What about this? And then he comes up with rebuttals to all of those rebuttals that are like pages long. And honestly, it's like very boring to read. Okay. But what he does is one of the questions that he asks is, how do I know that God exists and is the creator? Which is very similar to one of the questions that I ask you and very similar to the question that you ask some adults in your life. This is a question that people have been asking always. This is not a new question. And what he does is he comes up with 5 ways to know that God exists. And what he does is he uses the natural world around him to make these arguments. So he will say something like, I observe that the world is intricate and beautiful. Okay. He looks at a leaf under a microscope, or he looks at the rings on a tree, or he looks at just the complexity of the human body. And then he makes some sort of a determination about his conclusion is like, okay, the world is intricate and beautiful and complicated. There must have been someone who created it that way. Okay, so he makes all of these proofs are based on his observations about the world, and then he connects them to God in some way. Okay, so when you work with your group, you are going to look at these different proofs and you are going to determine what he observes about the world and how he connects that observation to God. Okay, so I will tell you more about that later, but feel free to rewind this video as you need in order to make sure that you understand all of the information. Thanks.